Hi, I'm Lena, and welcome to Super Data JP, the channel where we turn Japan's real estate and cost of living numbers into answers you can actually use. Every video here is built on verified government data, not opinions and not guesses. Whether you're planning to invest, relocate, or just curious what life in Japan really costs, you're in the right place. Let's get into today's numbers.
If you own rental property in Japan but live abroad, your tenant may already be deducting 20.42% of your rent before it ever reaches you, and most non-resident landlords never file the one form that gets most of it back. It's not a scam or a mistake. It's the system working exactly as designed. Second video in our tax series, After Resident Tax. This time, what actually happens when you own Japanese property but don't live in Japan, a situation a lot of the foreign investors watching this channel are already in, or plan to be. Rent paid to a non-resident landlord is subject to 20.42% withholding at the source, and the tenant, not you, is legally responsible for deducting it and paying it to the tax office. There's one major exemption: an individual tenant renting the property for their own or a family member's residence. In that specific case, no withholding applies at all. The distinction depends entirely on who your tenant is. Here's the trap that catches even careful owners. If a property management company master leases your unit and sublets it to the actual occupant, the management company is legally your tenant, not the person living there. Withholding applies regardless of whether that occupant is an individual using it as their home. And this isn't hypothetical carelessness on your part. Plenty of property management companies handling foreign owners simply don't know this rule exists and never withhold at all, which quietly shifts the compliance risk back onto you as the actual taxpayer of record. Tax treaties between Japan and the landlord's home country can reduce or eliminate this rate, so the real rate can be lower depending on where you live. But Japan doesn't apply that automatically. You have to know to ask. This isn't arbitrary. Japan has limited practical ability to chase down tax owed by someone who's already left the country, so it collects a rough estimate up front, at the source, before the money ever crosses a border. Whoever withholds it has to remit it to the tax office by the 10th of the following month, a compliance detail that matters more to your tenant or property manager than to you directly, but worth knowing exists. Here's the part that actually matters for your wallet: that 20.42% is not your final tax bill. It's a flat, blunt estimate, and for most landlords, the real number after deductions is dramatically lower. Rental income specifically requires comprehensive taxation, sogo kaze, via annual tax return. Unlike some other passive income types for non-residents, this one doesn't end at the withholding. You're expected to file. Real expenses come off the top first: depreciation, property tax, management fees, loan interest, and repairs all reduce the income that actually gets taxed. Non-residents don't get every deduction a resident would, though. You're limited to exactly 3: casualty loss deduction, donation deduction, basic deduction. No social insurance deduction, no dependent deduction. One option worth investigating with a tax professional: registering for the blue return filing status instead of the standard white return. It requires proper bookkeeping, but it can unlock a meaningfully larger deduction on top of everything else. That basic deduction is worth 480,000 yen, about $2,963, and it phases out once your total Japan income passes 25 million yen. But almost no individual landlord gets anywhere near that. Keep whatever payment records or withholding statements your tenant or management company provides. That documentation is what actually lets you claim credit for tax already withheld when you file. Skip filing entirely, and the withheld amount simply becomes your final tax with no refund. Japan doesn't owe you the difference unless you actually ask for it on a return. The reverse can also happen, though it's rarer for an individual landlord. If your actual tax liability turns out higher than what was withheld, a large portfolio, high rents, few deductible expenses, filing is what surfaces that gap, and interest can accrue on any balance paid late. Concretely, a non-resident owner renting a unit to a company for 150,000 yen a month, a corporate tenant, so withholding definitely applies here, no exemption in sight. That's 1,800,000 yen, about $11,111, a year in rent. 367,560 yen gets withheld before it ever arrives, leaving 1,432,440 yen actually deposited. Now subtract real expenses, illustratively 600,000 yen in depreciation, property tax, and management fees, the kind of costs that come with owning any rental property, and the basic deduction on top. Taxable income drops all the way to 720,000 yen. At Japan's progressive rates, that lands entirely in the lowest bracket, an actual tax bill of roughly 36,000 yen, nowhere near the flat percentage that was withheld all year. Compare that to the 367,560 yen already withheld over the year. Filing a return here recovers roughly 331,560 yen, about $2,047. Money that simply sits with the tax office indefinitely if you never file for it. One contrast worth knowing from our last video, resident tax genuinely does not apply to you if you have no residence in Japan as of January 1st. This income tax obligation is completely separate, and it doesn't get the same exemption. The filing window itself is the same one every resident uses, February 16th through March 15th of the following year, as long as a tax administrator is properly registered with the tax office in advance. And exactly like the departure trap from our resident tax video, owning Japanese property as a non-resident requires appointing a nosy ikanrini, tax administrator, someone in Japan to handle your filing and correspondence on your behalf. This affects any foreign investor who bought Japanese property and later moved abroad, anyone renting through a Japanese property management company rather than directly to an individual tenant, and anyone who's been quietly accepting the withheld amount as their final number without ever filing a return, sometimes for years in a row without realizing it. Practical steps. Confirm whether your specific leasing structure triggers withholding, especially if a management company is involved. Keep documentation for every deductible expense including depreciation schedules and property tax receipts. Appoint a tax administrator before you need one, and file every single year even in years the refund looks small. Waiting until several years have piled up only makes the paperwork harder to reconstruct. If you've watched our city-by-city investment breakdowns on this channel, this is the tax layer that sits underneath every one of those yield numbers. The gross rental yield you calculated before buying isn't the number that actually lands in your account. Next in this series, gift tax versus inheritance tax in Japan, and which one actually costs you less. The 20.42% withheld from your rent was never designed to be fair. It's a placeholder, calculated with no idea what your actual expenses or deductions look like, and applied the same way whether you own one apartment or 10. Filing is what turns that placeholder into what you actually owe, and for most landlords, that number is smaller. Quick recap. Withholding rate 20.42%, basic deduction 480,000 yen, allowed non-resident deductions limited to 3 categories, and in our model case, a refund of roughly 331,560 yen simply for filing. That's what non-resident landlords are quietly leaving on the table by not filing. Subscribe for the rest of this tax series, and for more data-driven breakdowns of life and investing in Japan.
And that's today's breakdown. If you're serious about real estate or moving to Japan, research like this is exactly what separates a smart decision from an expensive mistake. Subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive, and drop a comment if there's a city or word you want us to cover next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.